An investigation into this submerged aircraft begins by fixing the boundary between the loss event and the recovery effort. The primary objective is the safe retrieval of an intact bomber airframe for historical preservation without inducing structural failure. The target is a Heinkel He 111H series medium bomber on Lake Jonsvatnet, commonly recorded in Norwegian recovery sources as an H2, though one museum survivor record lists Werknummer 2320 as an H1. Before intervention, the team had to verify the aircraft against its exact identifiers. The historical ledger confirms the aircraft holds the specific factory designation, Werknummer 2320. The operational and recovery record connects this specific airframe to the first Staffel of Kampfgruppe 100. The fuselage carries the distinctive tactical code 6N+NH. Kampfgruppe 100 operated as a specialist navigation and pathfinder formation during this period, before the later full-wing designation Kampfgeschwader 100. The structural layout of the H2 variant dictates specific handling requirements due to its internal bulkheads and specialized equipment bays. Verifying these exact designations ensures the recovery team understands the general weight distribution and structural hardpoints of the aluminum shell they intend to hoist. The chronological gap originates on April 20, 1940. On this date, von Casimir landed the aircraft on the frozen surface of Lake Jonsvatnet after a mission to the Namsos area, nearly out of fuel. The bomber was then parked for preparation for another sortie, but later that afternoon, its main wheels sank through the softening ice and the aircraft settled onto its belly. This event locked the airframe into a specific geographical coordinate. The failed recovery from the ice initiated a sequence of events that isolated the bomber from the surface world. The pilot's logbook, as cited in local historical records and modern wreck documentation, confirm the location and date with high confidence, making the landing and subsequent ice failure the initiating event for the recovery timeline. By the 2004 surface operation, more than 64 years underwater had turned the bomber into a fragile archaeological load rather than a standard mechanical object. Engineers had to calculate the reduced load-bearing capacity of the primary airframe components, while the undisturbed condition increased both the forensic value of the site and the technical risk of disturbing it. The physical recovery of the machine intersected with a rare biological timeline. The original pilot who commanded the aircraft during the 1940 forced landing was Arthur von Casimir. In a distinctive alignment of historical survival and modern engineering, Arthur von Casimir was present on the shoreline during the 2004 recovery operation. He was 96 years old at the time of the lift. His presence gave the operation a direct human link to the forced landing. As the original aircraft commander watched from the shoreline, the recovery team brought the physical evidence of his forced landing back to the surface. This closed the chronological gap between the original operational decision and the modern engineering resolution. The pilot and the machine survived the initial encounter with the frozen surface, but the mechanism that moved the intact bomber from ice to lake bed requires a closer look at the environmental limits around it. What operational mechanisms originally forced this specific airframe into the deep lake environment? A frozen surface offers a temporary operational platform, but imposes a strict thermal boundary on all aviation activities. On natural ice, the aircraft's weight was safe only while the surface retained enough bearing strength under its landing gear. By late spring, the natural runway was entering its terminal phase. Spring thaw degraded the ice field until its crystalline structure no longer provided the upward support required to hold the concentrated weight of the aircraft tires. This irreversible loss of structural integrity forced an immediate and highly constrained trade-off on the surface. Without heavy lifting equipment or specialized recovery vehicles, moving the airframe to shore across the degrading ice was physically impossible. The crews therefore abandoned any full surface extraction and turned to rapid component stripping. This localized dismantling process focused purely on strict mechanical utility and immediate operational needs. The ground personnel managed to remove one Jumo 211 engine from its nacelle. They removed vital equipment from the stranded machine, including instruments, radio equipment, and tail components. This deliberate decision maximized immediate resource recovery while conceding the total loss of the primary airframe. Removing the heavy forward engines and draining the fuel also fundamentally altered the center of gravity of the remaining structure. The bomber was no longer a balanced flying machine. It became a hollowed-out aluminum shell resting precariously on a rapidly deteriorating surface. Once the spring thaw continued, the physical state of the airframe changed permanently. The bomber had already settled on its belly after the main wheels broke through the soft ice, and as the ice failed further, the abandoned structure eventually slipped beneath the waterline and began its descent into the dark water column. The exact descent cannot be reconstructed with certainty from the available sources, but the recovered condition shows that the airframe reached the lake bed without total breakup. On the bottom, the empty airframe settled into the soft lake bed far below the surface. It came to rest at a depth of about 74 meters, roughly 243 feet. This specific depth immediately isolated the bomber from any further surface salvage operations. The extreme depth placed the wreck far beyond the reach of standard recovery methods of the era. The failure of the ice airfield had placed the bomber beyond practical wartime recovery. How did an environment deep enough to swallow the bomber entirely ultimately protect its forensic signature? When an aluminum aircraft enters a submerged environment, the specific chemistry of the water dictates the forensic survival of the machine. A marine environment acts as a massive galvanic battery. Saltwater rapidly consumes lightweight aviation alloys and strips away all historical markings. A deep freshwater basin imposed a different chemical rule. Without salinity and with cold, oxygen-poor deep water, Lake Jonsvatnet created an arrested decay matrix instead of a galvanic destruction zone. Low temperature, darkness, and limited biological activity kept exterior details exposed rather than buried under growth or decay. The investigation of the submerged airframe relied entirely on this localized chemical stability. Because the lake bed lacked aggressive corrosive agents, the structural integrity of the fuselage remained sound. The thin aluminum skin panels and internal bulkheads did not dissolve or suffer severe pitting. The mechanical connections between the stringers and the main spars held their form. That integrity made the wreck a viable engineering target. A unified shell could survive a lift, while a crumbling metallic skeleton could not. More importantly, this freshwater anoxic preservation protected the most fragile layers of historical evidence applied to the exterior of the machine. The original paint applied to the bomber in 1940 survived the long submergence without flaking away or dissolving into the water column. Those surviving paint layers became the primary anchor proof for identification. When documenting a historic wreck, confirming the exact identity often requires intrusive physical measures. Investigators usually must scrape away marine growth or remove access panels to locate internal stamped manufacturer data plates. In this specific case, the arrested decay matrix rendered such intrusive steps entirely unnecessary. The original operational markings remain visible and legible on the exterior skin. The specific tactical code 6N+NH was readable along the flank of the fuselage. Furthermore, the specialist unit emblem associated with Kampfgruppe 100 survived on the forward nose section. This detailed emblem depicting a Viking ship under sail provided strong visual confirmation of the unit assignment. The survival of these painted graphics represents a rare forensic baseline in aviation archaeology. Relying on exterior paint for primary identification also imposes a strict handling discipline on the recovery team. If the paint is the primary historical proof, any careless manipulation by underwater vehicles or dragging cables will permanently erase that proof. The team must treat the thin layer of pigment as a primary structural constraint. The rigging plan, therefore, had to avoid the markings and rule out standard heavy salvage grabs or chains. The structural integrity and the forensic integrity were physically fused together on the skin of the bomber. This exceptional state of preservation established a distinct operational baseline. The aircraft was mechanically sound enough to withstand a coordinated lifting operation. The visual evidence was pristine enough to justify the immense logistical effort required for a full museum recovery. However, the very nature of this specific lake created a severe administrative and environmental paradox. The pristine water that protected the historical paint and aluminum was heavily guarded by modern civilian regulations. What unprecedented operational barriers blocked access to a structurally sound airframe sitting in clear water? A submerged archaeological site often exists in a jurisdictional vacuum where investigators operate with significant freedom. This specific lake presented the exact opposite condition. Lake Jonsvatnet was the primary municipal drinking water reservoir for about 140,000 people in the Trondheim area, so public health outranked historical recovery. Access to the deep water environment therefore depended on municipal permission and on the National Food Safety Authority responsible for drinking water sources, with regulators able to stop the recovery if contamination occurred. Protecting a massive public water supply from industrial contamination requires unyielding legal boundaries. The municipal authorities impose strict operational time windows and environmental regulations on the entire recovery effort. Standard salvage machinery, hydraulic systems, support barges, and remotely operated vehicles carried the ordinary industrial risks of fuel, grease, dirt, and petroleum residue, which became unacceptable inside a municipal reservoir. Mitigation centered on strict water protection measures, a limited operating window, oil booms, and treated vessels. The clearest documented cleaning requirement applied to the barge and every boat used on the lake, each chemically treated before the lift. Other equipment remained subject to the same drinking water restrictions. The 2004 lift operation was executed by a specialized dive and remotely operated vehicle company known as Sastad AS. For this contractor, the environmental mandate converted a heavy lifting job into a tightly controlled municipal operation. The engineering team had to manage cranes, fuel, and hydraulic equipment under a strict pollution prevention regime. A ruptured hydraulic line or fuel leak could have stopped the operation and contaminated the reservoir. The sterilization mandate also forced the team to manage the invisible risk of biological transfer. Moving marine equipment from coastal saltwater ports or other inland freshwater lakes into Jonsvatnet risked introducing invasive microscopic organisms into the city water supply. The chemical wash neutralized these biological hitchhikers, but it demanded immense time, specialized cleaning agents, and extensive manpower. The recovery window opened only after sterilization checks were complete. Beyond surface contamination, the protocol restricted deep sediment disturbance, so the rigging plan had to minimize silt movement before the city granted final access. A submerged wrecks orientation can set the extraction limit before any cable is attached. In this operation, the target had descended through the water column and impacted the bottom completely upside down. It came to rest lying directly on its dorsal surface. This geometry eliminated normal access to the lower structural components used in standard rigging. The engineering team faced a distinct operational trade-off. They could attempt to attach cables and roll the 64-year-old aluminum structure underwater to correct its orientation. Alternatively, they could rig the airframe and hoist it exactly as it lay on the bottom. Rolling the submerged airframe would have imposed lateral twisting forces and asymmetrical torque on an unsupported aluminum shell, risking catastrophic spar failure. To prevent breaking the machine into multiple pieces, the engineers elected to execute the extraction in the inverted orientation. This decision preserved the structural integrity but forced the team to solve a complex reverse load path problem. Because the inverted lift reversed the normal load path, the lifting forces had to be spread across multiple wide support bands rather than concentrated against the dorsal fuselage and fragile canopy frames. The recovery team attached lifting wires and support rigging to the inverted aircraft according to the documented recovery plan. Each contact point had to be managed carefully so the soft lake bed and the preserved aluminum skin were not damaged. Working at 74 meters, the recovery team used underwater support equipment and surface lifting gear to establish a controlled lift path. The center of gravity had shifted since 1940 because one engine and other vital equipment had been removed before the aircraft sank. The rigging geometry had to account for that missing weight so the tail and wings would not swing into an uncontrolled load during ascent. Another local constraint involved sediment inside the inverted fuselage. Before the lift, there was concern that this mud could add hidden dead weight to the fragile structure, though later reports said there was less mud than feared. The recovery team still had to treat that sediment as an uncertain load. Once the rigging was secure, the surface crane initiated the vertical extraction. The hoist had to be exceptionally slow to prevent dynamic shock loads from snapping the aged structure. During the ascent, the engineers continuously monitored the tension on the main lift wire. The carefully distributed load path held, supporting the bare aluminum shell without buckling the spine or crushing the dorsal crew stations. The inverted bomber finally broke the surface of the lake. float tanks were immediately attached to the upside-down structure to stabilize it safely at the waterline. Managing the transition from the dense water column into the open air is always the most hazardous phase of any subsea extraction. The water trapped inside the fuselage added massive temporary weight that had to drain away before the crane could lift the machine completely clear of the lake. Only after that trapped water drained away could the operation shift from extraction to preservation. Once the bomber broke the surface, what final decision governed its permanent preservation? Once the Heinkel reached the surface, the operation shifted from lifting a wreck to preparing a vulnerable museum artifact for transport and conservation. Moving the medium bomber by road required reducing the airframe to legal highway dimensions. To facilitate the complex logistical transport to Germany, the local engineering crews carefully detached the primary wings from the central fuselage directly on the shoreline. It required the engineers to carefully manipulate the main structural connection points without snapping the aged attachment bolts or tearing the surrounding aluminum skin. This was controlled separation, not accidental structural tearing. During the surface preparation, the team also had to extract the remaining internal mud without scratching the surviving exterior paint. After the disassembled components were transferred to the Deutsches Technikmuseum Berlin, the public record confirms a restoration and conservation destination, but not a completed treatment plan. Standard aviation restoration often prioritizes stripping away decades of wear. Institutions frequently replace damaged metal panels and apply fresh layers of modern paint to simulate a pristine factory-new appearance. An aggressive cosmetic restoration would risk destroying the physical evidence that made the deep water extraction significant. The safe documented conclusion is narrower. The museum takeover secured a rare recovered Heinkel, while the condition at recovery, good, incomplete, and carrying visible original markings, remains the strongest confirmed point. Claims about replica engines, weapons, repainting, or final display treatment should remain unconfirmed unless supported by the museum's own conservation records. The defensible endpoint is clear. The Heinkel was recovered from Jonsvatnet in 2004, disassembled on the shoreline by German specialists, and transferred to the Deutsches Technikmuseum Berlin as part of the restoration arrangement. Its surviving markings, incomplete structure, and documented recovery history make it a rare physical witness to the frozen lake airfield at Jonsvatnet.